Good evening, and a big hello from Silicon Valley, Bay Area. Welcome to our virtual South Asian Literature and Art program. And Art Forum today is really proud to bring this program called Healing Through Art because because the guest today is somebody we all truly cherish. Salima Hashmi and her daughter Mira Hashmi, they'll be here from Pakistan. But before we dive into this program, I would like all our viewers to please like and subscribe our event if you want to know more about what we bring to the Bay Area. Uh, the work we do is truly unique. We try to promote contemporary art coming from South Asia and its diaspora. And really, we can't do this without your support. So please do like and subscribe, and better still, donate. To start off this event, we have a very dear friend of Art Forum, Dr. Robert Mintz. I will include him here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's the deputy director of Asian Art Museum and a very dear friend of Art Forum. And the Asian Art Museum here in the Bay Area is a very iconic institution and hosts numerous contemporary artwork, and it's a pride and joy for us. So having him here is amazing. Robert, you really handle important aspects of the museum as the deputy director. He has a key leadership role, responsible for the curatorial conversation and education and museum service, and along with the director, Jesu, responsible for the strategic growth and development of the museum. And we are really delighted to have you here to kick off this event and to introduce our guest. So I leave the floor to you, or should I say the virtual space, and I will sign off. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Ambika, and thank you to everyone at Art Forum for this event tonight. Good evening, everybody, and good morning to those of you who are in the world where it is morning right now. I am Robert Mintz. I'm the Deputy Director at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And if you'll allow me a brief diversion from my prepared remarks, I wanted to recognize that today, our president signed into law a new federal holiday marking Juneteenth, which is celebrated every year on the 19th of June. It's the day when the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached Galveston, Texas in 1865, a full 2 years and more after it was issued. This ended a very long and very ugly period of American history during which the enslavement of Black people in America was continued until this fateful day. It is really, it's very rare in our country for a new holiday to be declared, and we should all realize we're living in historic times. It's been a year of historic times, but this is a very positive movement. So just wanted to say that. So as I'm sure you all know, here in the Bay Area, we're enjoying the rapid reduction in pandemic restrictions on our ability to move around, to meet each other, to enjoy our favorite cultural activities. You know, our museums are open and art is once again accessible in its many forms in many locations, not least of which the Asian Art Museum, where I hope all of you are soon able to join me and enjoy the art. Of course, the pandemic is not over until it's over for everyone, everywhere. Our friends in South Asia and in many other parts of the world are still facing substantial numbers of new cases and new hospitalizations. And we must do all that we can now to ensure people all over the world are able to enjoy the feelings we are enjoying as we experience them in our small corner of the world. And we hope that today's program is one small step toward healing some of the wounds that have been felt over this past difficult year. So, with that said, it is my pleasure and my honor to get to introduce our speakers today. Salima Hashmi is an extraordinary artist and social change maker. She is an artist, a curator, a contemporary art historian. Professor Hashmi was the founding dean of the Miriam Dawood School of Visual Arts and Design at Beacon House National University in Lahore. She was professor of fine arts at the National College of Arts in Lahore and also principal of the college. Her publications have ranged widely from studies of Pakistani contemporary art to single artist studies to essays on art and aesthetics. She has curated critically acclaimed exhibitions for such prestigious institutions and venues as the Asia Society in New York City, and she's curated for the Delhi Art Fair in Delhi, India. In addition, she's a council member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and a founding member of Women's Action Forum. I think those tributes speak wonderful volumes of what kind of person Salima Hashmi truly is. In conversation today, she will be speaking with her daughter, Mira Hashmi. Mira is an assistant professor teaching film studies at Lahore School of Economics. She's a graduate of the Mel Hoppenheim School of Cinema at Concordia University in Montreal. Mira's also been writing about film for various publications for 30 years now. Her areas of interest include the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock and Hindi masala movies. She has 2 children. One of them, of course, these are Salima's grandchildren. One of them is named after her grandfather, and the other is named for a character from the TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I love that. I wish I had another child to name right now. Her first book, Gulzar's Ijazat, Insights into the Film, was published in 2019. Mira, I believe the microphone is now yours. You get to take it away.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Art Forum and Ambika for asking me to be involved in this. My mother and I, and I'm going to refer to her as Ammi from this point onwards, otherwise it's going to take much longer. We live in the same house. At this time, we're about, I think if it were a straight line, about 30 feet away from each other. But this is very unusual because our conversations usually, consist of deciding what to order for our Saturday family dinner, or what to do about this horrible amount of pigeon poo in our porch, and so on and so forth. So this is quite strange, but hopefully should be interesting for everyone who's watching or listening. Right, so it's customary to kind of begin at the beginning, so looking back. But I think that in the current circumstances, that really carries an extra layer of resonance, because I think in times of adversity, just in hard times, and I've certainly felt this over the past year or so, that longing to look back actually becomes very, very powerful. There's this overwhelming sense of nostalgia. You're looking at YouTube, looking for the familiar, the films and the music that you used to listen to or look at in your childhood. So, if we were to look back right to your beginning, to your childhood, your youth, and of course it was a very eventful childhood and youth and beyond, what are some of the vivid memories that have stayed with you and that perhaps you've gone back to in the past year, and things that perhaps you think might have informed the paths, some of the paths that you forged afterwards?
Thank you, Mira, and thank you, Art Forum. It seems, quite magical in certain ways to be talking across continents and envisioning myself for a moment in San Francisco while I'm very much in Lahore. Yes, when one looks back, I think I owe a great deal to the fact that, there are 2 extraordinary people who were my parents. On the one side, there's Faiz Ahmed Faiz, at that time a newly emergent poet and a teacher. And then there's this Anglo-Saxon feisty woman, Alice George as she was then, and she'd come to the subcontinent to visit her sister, who was married to a man of letters, Dr. Tasir. And they met, And it was an extraordinary meeting in the sense that over a period of time, because my mother couldn't go back to England because the war was breaking out in Europe. So there she was in Amritsar, and often meeting this shy young man who was teaching at the same institution where her brother-in-law was principal. And a friendship developed. Unlikely, but it happened. My grandmother, my father's mother, was aghast when she heard what was happening. How could her favorite son even think of consorting with a white woman? You know, these were the days the colonizer was not something that everyone looked forward to associating. So, but they waited until my grandmother gave in. She insisted that my mother become a Muslim, that she learn Urdu, with everything my mother did. And if you look at the first picture, Mira, if you share with the audience, in which there is, there's my mother in her gharara, and there's yours truly, and that by that time, there was. It was obvious that things in the subcontinent were hotting up. We were heading towards independence, but also possible partitioning of the subcontinent. And that, I suppose, for my early childhood is the most important event that I was inevitably, of course, like all people in the subcontinent, part of it. But because my father had moved already, because it seemed that there would be a Pakistan. And so before actually 1947, 14th of August, which is the day that Pakistan was formed, 15th was the day that India formally got independence. We were already in Lahore. In fact, we were in Srinagar. But the carnage that happened, and because my father was a newspaper man, Pakistan Times and Imroz, it was very much part of what formed my early memory of great turbulence and turmoil, and human beings being almost unprepared for that. And the vivid memories are of great pain that something momentous was born out of. So yes, that was the earliest memory. If you took to the other image that we have, is then many years later, and there are still these two remarkable people in my life. They are, it's many years later, and then it was time of exile for my father, because Pakistan was going through its own oppressive military regime, and that's when he moved to Beirut, and he worked alongside the Palestinians. But I would like to talk a little bit about certain events in my childhood, which I think taught me a great deal. And one of them was my father's incarceration in prison. 1951, he was taken away one morning, and for 4 years he was in jail. The charges were, as happens when states don't like a public intellectual or somebody's voice who they want to be silenced, and I think we see this a lot in our world today, in our neighborhood too, is that you simply put away that voice. And so the trial was one of sedition and all the rest of it. We are familiar with charges, wherever they are in the world, from Latin America to Africa to Asia. It is happening all the time. So I think that taught me something else. It taught me about loyalty of friends, taught me about the oppressiveness of state organs. It taught me of the courage of people. My mother's extraordinary dealing with what had happened to her, going to work to support two young girls, and my father in jail, taking it with great calm. And we used to go and visit him. It was quite far away from Lahore in Hyderabad. Night journey in a train. and then meeting him for a brief day. So, what kept them going was number one, his poetry, which used to come from jail, which was published, brought him a lot of followers. And then they sustained themselves with these letters. And now, many, many years later, those letters are now published and they are taken up and read and dramatized by people who I think are sending out into the world these missives of courage and affection and great hope. And I'd like to read, if I may, a little piece out of one of my father's letters to my mother, in which obviously he is giving her courage to face her loneliness and the uncertainty of whether he was ever going to come back again. And I've read it again in these days because I think, in a way, what he said then from a jail cell in Hyderabad rings true of all people who are really in suffering. He's writing to her about the difference between unhappiness and pain. And he writes and says, I think pain and unhappiness are distinct and different things. And it is possible to go on suffering pain without being really unhappy. Pain is something external, something that comes from without, an ephemeral accident, like a physical ailment, like our present separation, like the death of a brother. His brother had died while he was in prison. Unhappiness, on the other hand, although produced by pain, is something within yourself, which grows, develops, and envelopes you if you allow it to do so and do not watch out. Pain, no one can avoid, but unhappiness you can overcome if you consider something worthwhile enough to live for. And then he adds, perhaps I'm becoming pedantic again, so I shall leave it. And then he carries on. The weather here is exactly as you left it, only the nights have become a little colder. I'm in good spirits and better health, and thinking of you and the funny faces, which is what he called myself and my sister, with all the love that is in my heart. Kiss the little ones from me. All my love, Fairs. And in case you think that my mother wrote back, equally moving letters, yes, she did. But then there was this great sense of humor between them. So I picked out these little lines which she once wrote to him and said, today, somebody paid me a sort of left-handed compliment. Mrs. Fairs, if I had a wife like you, I wouldn't mind going to jail. Funny, but I suppose jail isn't going too bad if you have a good wife. But it becomes rather involved because a good wife is no good if you are in jail. Or is it? So there was this bantering that went on back and forth between them. I think those 4.5 years of separation in which I sort of grew up. I was 8 when he left and I was over 12 when he came back. I considered myself quite an adult when he returned. And it brought us as a family the feeling that you can face great issues, but then you also learn what are the really important things in life. I think that stood one in good stead. Mira, as you know, this is my father's, the image of my father the day after he came out of jail. And there is myself and my sister to the left of him and to the right of this photograph. And the other 3 people are the children of my aunt, Dr. Tasir's children. Dr. Tasir had passed away, left me, my aunt, as a widow. And hanging on to my father is my cousin Salman Tasir, who grew up, became a very successful businessman, but also a politician, and was the governor of the Punjab when he was assassinated by an extremist who was his own guard. So as a family, I think we have faced these vicissitudes, but also learned perhaps what it is to believe in truth and to believe in struggle, to believe that you have a responsibility to move society forward. Um, and all of this, I knew that I wanted to do two things. One was to be creative. I was definitely not going to be a poet because that space was taken up by this grand banyan tree, and there was no question of. I mean, imagine if you're a lesser poet, and people sort of say, "Oh, but I mean, look at her father's poetry, and then look what she's doing." So there was no way of going. But I used to draw and paint as a child, and was encouraged, and so I went on to art school, and I also knew that I wanted to teach. So those were the years in which I studied, firstly in Lahore at the National College of Arts, and then went off to England for 3 years and did a degree there. So it was in that sense a blossoming of what I thought was within me, but also it was a feeling that I was always going to come back home to Pakistan, which we did.
So, if we segue into, as you mentioned, the teaching and later on television and
Yes.
performing arts as well.
Yeah.
So, talk about that time. And of course, I remember from my childhood that a lot of that involved very difficult times as well after General Ziaul Haq took power in 1977. So it seems that there's always a lot of healing to be done because the hard times don't let up.
No, that's true because I met my husband, who we act. I mean, it's an ultimate cliche because we were acting opposite one another in a play in Lahore, and that's how we met. Then went off to England. He studied drama, then he was actually a professor of economics. So there we were, and then coming back, and we were part of television. But yes, Ziaul Haq's time, and it's quite strange. My father was arrested on the night of 8th and 9th March 1951. And Shoaib, your father, was arrested on the same night, 8th and 9th of March in 1981. So 30 years later, it seemed like, strange replay. And you were exactly the same age as I was when my father went to jail. I mean, luckily, Shoaib's incarceration was, a short one, a brief one, a couple of months. But the feeling is the same, that you have children and you want to shield them and protect them. But on the other hand, I mean, my mother used to sit me down and used to say, your father is not a smuggler. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't loot anybody. He's going to jail because he told the truth. So you learned very early on that the truth is a troublesome matter, and you have to pay for it. Yes, Shoaib and I, because we were performers apart from our roles as teachers, mine at the National College of Arts, he at Government College Lahore, teaching economics, but we shared a love of performance. And that's how, in early television in Pakistan, we became very much part of it. I think you might have a picture of one of our play. We started out with this wonderful program for children called Akkar Bakkar, which is a game that little kids play. And he's there in the background with Shahina, who was the mime, and I'm the compere. So this was a sort of a program for children, loosely based on Sesame Street in a sense. It was about contemporary learning through visuals. It won the Japan Prize for children's television. Those were the days of black and white television, so you can see how long it was. But we did try to set up a whole new way of addressing audiences, which was highly informal. We did an adults program after that, which was called Sach Gup, and then later Tal Matol, which was a satire, sort of like Rowan and Martin's Laugh. That was the week that was a magazine program in which one was. And they became iconic characters, which we picked out of society. And then there were many other programs later, which once in Zia's time, we were banned from television for 11 long years. And we never quite got back to it in the same way. But while we enjoyed it, while we did it, and we were both teachers. So that was something I think that gave us a feeling that we were giving back to what we had gained ourselves through our education. So this is a picture of, I'm working with children inside the old city of Lahore. I was in the art college, but one summer we took the students out and we advertised in the old city of Lahore and in this very old school which we had given to us for the summer. They did art, but I also did traditional rhymes because one found that the children had never experienced an art class. So we used to loosen them up I used to tell them stories and games and poems. And then they would turn out the most wonderful paintings after that because they were no longer afraid of being in the classroom. Some of these children were street kids who'd never actually been in a formal setup before. But of course, my, if I may say, real job was, across the way at the National College of Arts, which before 47, by the way, was it was the Mayo School of Art. And it was one of the 4 set up by the British in the subcontinent. The others were in Bombay and Calcutta and Madras, what is now Chennai. So here I am with some of my students. And to the right of this photograph, you see somebody who became very celebrated, the artist Shazia Sikandar. And I think her work has been seen in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. So these were my years, which I started formally teaching from 1970, and I taught for 30 years at the National College of Arts, which is the premier art institution in Pakistan. I was lucky enough to be the principal also for 4 years. And I think that one learned in those years how to navigate very difficult times very often outside the institution. But because it was lucky enough, to have some of the cream of talented students from all over the country, and also a dedicated faculty who stuck together in good days and bad. So there were some hilarious moments when we were questioned for what we were doing. But because we had a degree of academic freedom, we were able to sustain what was a really, really interesting, innovative art and design school, well in line with the 20th century, which wasn't really happening very much in the subcontinent. Art schools there had pretty much stayed with what the British left. But they're changing now. But at the time when the National College of Arts came into being from the Mayo School in 1958, there was a radical shift. And you were encouraged, firstly, to go back to the roots. So we took expeditions into places like at that time, very remote Swat Valley or the interior of Sindh or to Cholistan, to record and to document lives and crafts of people, but also coming back and looking at what the role of the artist or the designer or the architect, because it's an architecture school also, was in a rapidly urbanizing country, and looking at political and social pressures and somehow knitting them into your curriculum, and devising new curriculums was the biggest challenge. And of course, then there was what was happening outside. Well, there was a Women Actions Forum coming into being against the oppressive laws of Zia-ul Haq. And pretty much you would find, students and some of the faculty sneaking out and becoming part of those demonstrations, in certain cases getting arrested also. And my work changed. My work was then about what one saw as very important issues. And so in the 1980s, we got together with women artists and we did a manifesto. This is one of my works, which is slightly later. It is called A Poem for Zainab. And it was a work which was done in response to a really horrifying incident of domestic violence which occurred not far from Islamabad, which is reported in the press, where this woman was abused in a manner that I cannot even describe by a husband who just happened to be a cleric. And at that time Benazir Bhutto was the prime minister, and she rushed to this woman's bedside, couldn't even describe what had happened. She was sent abroad for treatment, and when she came back, there was this photograph in the paper of this woman greeting her little 5-year-old boy on the tarmac. And the smile on her face after what she had been through was something that stayed with me. And so this series of works that I called A Poem for Zainab came about at the time. There's my own face, which is silenced, with a band across the mouth. And then there is a turbulence of emotion, but also hopefully of action. So I used pigment and tea wash and collage for the surface. And I think in a way, my activism and my art went together. And perhaps because I was part of a larger group, women who had signed the Women Artists Manifesto, which was drafted in my house with my friend Lara Rook, also an artist, and 13 or 14 women artists signed it. And I think it altered the direction of the work of many of us, women who perhaps could be described as apolitical, but they came together through the signing of this manifesto. And their work also, it changed. I think my search for new curriculums, which would embrace an artist's examination of where they lived and how they were part of society, was something that affected my students also.
I was going to ask about that. I mean, it's almost 50 years of teaching, and so many students who have gone on to do very, very well. You mentioned, and we saw a photograph of Shazia Sikandar, and there are many others as well. And we have a selection of images, so I'll go into that.
Yes. I had to look for sources of curriculums and look at examples. And one of the things that, I had read a lot of K.G. Subramaniam, The Living Tradition. So I was curious enough actually to make the journey to Shanti Niketan, to Kala Bhavan, to go and sit at the feet of K.G. Subramaniam. And he had retired from Baroda by then, and he was, on the outskirts, and I went to see him. And he said, "I don't believe you have come from Lahore to talk to me about curriculum." And I said, "Yes, because we share both the strong tradition of the crafts, and we find it absent from art schools. And you try to do that in Baroda. And I want to know how you visualize the new art school." And because the curriculum is, the pivot on which we hang what we want to do. So he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Salima, you can have the best curriculums in the world, but you need the teachers who are going to deliver it." He said, "In Baroda, I had 5 good teachers. Never mind about the curriculum." And I think, in a sense, what he said was something that I knew instinctively, that yes, that was the point of it. And when I came back, and I hope because of firstly because of that meeting, I think it reassured me about certain things that I'd been wanting to do, because I had these dreams of bringing a craftsman into every school in Pakistan and to be there as part of teaching, so that you had a network of various kinds of crafts which would grow alongside all education. But that was a dream, never realized. But in schools where I have been instrumental, art schools and design schools, one has tried to make the connection between centuries old crafts, whether it is weaving or whether it is printing, because they tend to be in the textiles, because they are still very much the living crafts which are available, and they have something professional to offer to them. So, but in the fine arts, it is more subtle, because what was happening at NCA was the arrival of the teaching of the miniature, the traditional miniature. And therefore, you had artists like Shazia Sikandar, who were trained as miniature painters and then went on to do a very contemporary practice. So, if you can have some of those images, this is one of her works done in the US, where she left. She went to RISD and then went on to have a very celebrated career. But you see the images that originally come out of motifs that are in the traditional miniature. And I think perhaps even more than that was, I hope, the spirit of peace. I took my students across the border, the difficult border, to India, where we met up with other artists who believed in peacemaking as the first step towards creativity. And Shazia was one of the group that we took on that trip to India. 86 was when the first year that we took, and there were 40 of us, 10 teachers and 30 students, and that became a very memorable moment. And so many years later, artists would come up to me and they say, "This is Hashmi, opening up that way of having dialogue with neighbors is something that has stayed with us through our practice." And if we can have some of the other images also. Faiza Bhatt was also one of the students this is a work that she did actually based on, the suicide bomber. But if you look at it, it has so many other elements. She lives in London now, but she comes and goes and exhibits her work. It is of that moment of combustion. But there's also within it, all of these satirical elements that she's added, because the extremist who is, detonating himself has dreams of paradise. And the dreams of paradise are kind of interwoven of what paradise means in this world. So there will be dollar bills, and there will be hair dryers, and there will be television sets, and there will be cookies, and be all the goodies that actually the deprived look for in this world. And then they are forced to go into an extremist way of working, which is, for not achievable except if you're dying for it, to go to another kind of paradise. So Faiza has done these rather remarkable, tiny dotted, using felt tip pens, which are beautifully laid. She was part of this show that was mentioned earlier, which I did at the Asia Society, which was called Hanging Fire. It was contemporary art of Pakistan, so she was very much part of that show. Next, could I have a next look at, Aisha Khalid, who is, as you can see, very much a miniature painter, but she also has moved into other mediums. And this is one of her works, which was, I think, where where she really, really was able to make the connection between the traditional space, the working space, and the motif of the woman who is silenced because she is clad in a burqa, but she is on these lotuses that are floating in this image, and the lotus is speaking, but she's hemmed in by this domestic space. It's claustrophobic, while at the same time it's highly patterned. So it's glorious to look at. So there's kind of a contradiction going on between the image and the desire to flower, to blossom, to move out, and the inevitability of tradition and the persistence of pattern, which is so much part of the vocabulary of the artist. And if we can go to the next one. And Adila is not one of my students, but very much an artist who I've worked with and who I think, admired, and of course made part of shows that I have curated. She works in Karachi. A new monograph has just been come out by her, published by Skira, which is a wonderful exploration of her work. And here she devised this motorcycle gear for women who go on motorcycle. I mean, they're always pillion riders, and they never wear helmets because there's only money enough for the male who's in the front to have a helmet. So she devised these helmets which are made out of domestic objects, whether it's the tea kettle or whether it's the milk can or whether it's the cooking pot, and wonderfully illuminated and decorated and ornamented by truck painters, and this sort of great sense of humor and irony which is underlying this work. And the first one was a huge installation which was called Behne Motorcycle Workshop, which is a motorcycle workshop, and then all the gear which women could have if they were, on motorbikes. And because in Pakistan women don't, they're only the riders at the back for their safety. She's continued to have wonderful, very, very, very versatile practice as a sculptor in Karachi, and runs an artist workshop, which is a collective called Vasal, very dynamic space for artists, and from all over the world actually come together. Next. Talha actually now lives in New York, again trained as a miniature painter, and she very often has used the subway map in New York as the Vasli. The Vasli is the painting surface, which is composed of many layers which are glued together and then highly burnished. I think when you look at something like this, there is that underlying message of healing, of joyousness, of adhering to the feeling that there is hope, whether it stems from something, the bounties of the earth, or whether it comes from man-made objects. And we have the next one, please. Risham Sayed, who teaches in Lahore, been a student, and in fact, these are all batches close to Shazia Sikandar and so on. So this is a rather wonderful series of works that she did, which won her the Abraj Prize. These are the series of quilts. I think one of the things that my curriculum busting taught me was to look to domestic crafts and processes which could become part of the woman artist's vocabulary. And she is one of the artists who used the domestic craft of quilt making, plus embroidery, plus printing, and these were maps of voyages across the worlds, which were to do with the search for things like cotton and the selling and the buying and the processing of cotton. And these have stories within them of these voyages and of these arrivals. The next image, please. Ruby Chishti, also very close to my heart and my soul. She now lives in New York. This is work that she did, which I have a gallery also, which promotes young artists called Rotas 2. And this is an installation. She's a sculptor, which is called "I Will Be Born 1,000 Times, No Matter How You Celebrate It." And at that time, her practice consisted of these female figures which were not quite human sized and not quite doll sized. And there is a kind of deep anguish. It is based on the fact that, when she was born, she was like the next daughter, and therefore there was no celebration at her birth, but there was only weeping. And she uses recycled materials. Her dead father's quilts she used, old items found in her mother's closets. I have to say that, when she turned from traditional sculptural materials to these, it came from, unbeknownst to me, because there was a big gap in her practice, and I asked her, "What are you doing these days?" I didn't know that she was looking after a paralyzed mother. And out of that came these figures, these mobile and yet eloquent, immobile yet eloquent in what they were saying. I think when I look at a work like this, I'm truly certain that the artists in their practices base what is happening to them and what is happening around them, and become like transmitters almost for collective feelings. And therefore, in these days which have been very difficult, and for people in South Asia, we have seen that these have been times of great sufferings, people having to move because of lockdowns, people actually of having no resources. And how have the artists responded? I think I have been really moved by certain things that I've seen. I'd like to share the fact that one of our most celebrated artists, Imran Qureshi, he did a work which he shared with me, and it was a work that he did for an auction that Indian artists got together to raise money for COVID victims. And so Imran sent his work over. It was an auction, and I was touched also by the title of the work, because it says, "When I Thought of You." And he sent me this image, and he said, "Mrs. Hashmi, I was so happy that my work raised the highest amount of money in this auction." He said it was actually the second highest. The first was raised by a work by a lady called Shergill. He was being funny, because that was what his gallery had said, only Shergill was fetched a higher price. It went for $17,000. And I just felt moved, because at this moment, when we are thinking of how first to save our own families, there was this desire to reach out across, because you could feel the pain of the people in India who were in far worse circumstance than us in Pakistan, where we have been luckier with our ability to combat the effects of the pandemic, and our positivity testing had gone way down. compared to what was happening across the border. And so this signified to me the sheer feeling of wanting to be part of someone else's suffering and trying to do what one could. And the artist, I think, perhaps does it best. And I'd like to just, Mira, if you could show the works of by Sara Ahmed. Sara is also a former student of mine and part of the same batch of Risham and Shazia and so on. For many years, she did not practice her art. Uh, and she came back to it much later because she was married and went off to the US and bad circumstances, etc. Coming back to her practice, she's been part of a series of works which have happened, and in fact, it's been very much in the news. Tom Hanks wrote a column in the New York Times about this event which happened 100 years ago and in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was called the Black Wall Street Massacre, in which, in this place, the Black people who had achieved a certain amount of prosperity were attacked by the people, the white people in the city, and hundreds of people were killed and they died and they were chased out of their homes. And they ran to save themselves. And this is something which has been commemorated because it's the 100th year of the Wall Street Massacre. So immemorial. And Sara became part of an artist project. And this is her installation, which she calls the American Dream. And she chose to do it actually we are looking at only part of it, which is a tent. And it has these images which are reproduced from the images of the actual, what happened there, the actual massacre, the burnt streets and the burnt houses. And Sara did something extremely, I think, deeply felt and profound. She was visiting Lahore because her father was very seriously ill. And she was still thinking about this work, which she was going to do. And she decided that she would take marigolds from Lahore, made by women, artisans, and they're made out of cotton cloth, sewn together. She gave them samples and they looked at marigolds. And as you know, marigolds are so much part of our celebrations, but also commemorations. And so she had these shipped to the US, and she also shipped real marigolds. So they were both, real flowers, but the arrival of real flowers is something that was a big question mark. But the flowers that were made by women artisans in Lahore were not. And there they were, with the inside of the tent, but actually the installation was outside in a large, so it's a park, which is, Greenwood, and that is where they were placed. If you can look at the last images, you can see that she was hoping through her work to really convey the idea of healing, that this is a time for healing. What the Black community has been through and is continuing to face, the suffering, the discrimination, is something actually which is particular, but it's also universal. And in the year of the pandemic, we know what it means. We know that the inequality that the pandemic has revealed. And therefore, her work, which is about, it's about the wiping out of a community of prosperous Black people, but it's also about the resilience of them coming back. And she said, I know it, so I was not, she was one of the many artists who were doing, because there are many projects that are going alongside this. But I think that it has spoken to people because it has a universal message, as well as being what it is about being. um, the really deprivation and the pain suffered, and it was questioned about whether a person who is not member of the black community in could actually be privileged enough to do something like this. But she worked. I mean, her the lead artist was a black artist, and they accepted her, and she worked with them. She studied the history, she did the research, and I think what has transpired after that is something which is cuts across all kinds of boundaries, all kinds of sufferings, all kinds of anguish. And it is about rebirth. It is about managing to bloom and blossom and to be yourself again. So, and of course, there are different responses, because Sarah told me that, because this is spread out over across the park. She said part of it had been vandalized also. But that too is part of what we accept. Because healing does not happen at once. It is a continuous process, and we keep doing it. We keep doing it, and it brings me really to one of again, if I may come back to Faiz. Faiz Ahmed Faiz wrote a small piece about the role of an artist, and somebody asked him, "What is the role of an artist?" And he said, "My answer would be, we are the offspring in the direct line of descent of the magicians and the sorcerers and the music makers of old. In times gone by, these ancients of ours could make the rain come down with their incantations and with their songs, and they could make the deserts bloom. And they not only implicitly believed that they had these powers, their community believed in it too. That is because they found, for the hopes and fears of their people, for their dreams and longings, words and music that the people could not find for themselves. And by bending their collective will to a desired end, they could sometimes make the dream come true." So that is who we are, the inheritors of the magic and the power of the magic, in big ways or small, depending on the intensity of our love our hearts possess, and the anguish we share with the anguished world, on the measure of our strength to defy what is evil and to uphold what is good. And thus, as a writer or artist, even though I run no state and command no power, I am entitled to feel that I am my brother's keeper, and my brother is the whole of mankind. And this is the relevance to me of peace, of freedom, of Datant, the elimination of the nuclear menace, and out of this vast brotherhood, the nearest to me and the dearest are the insulted and the humiliated, the homeless and the disinherited, the poor, the hungry, and the sick at heart. Faiz Ahmed Faiz. So that is what an artist does.
Well, that's it from our side, but I don't know if we have time for any questions, if anyone listening or watching has any questions, or indeed if our hosts have any comments or questions.
I'll offer a comment that's incredibly moving. It really is. Much of what you've shown this evening, and the ideas, the expressions of what it means to be healed, what it means to heal a community, I think they're food for thought, which is going to keep me thinking for days to come. And I just want to say thank you for such a beautiful presentation, and also that beautiful reading at the end. Is dinner at home like this every night, Mira?
Hardly. like I said, what do the kids want for their birthdays, and the pigeons in the porch.
I understand. Oh, so interesting. So there are so many comments of affirmation and compliments that have come from you have friends. You have friends here in the Bay Area, I will say, Salima and Mira. They are so moved by you. Um, Specific questions are few. So I think one thing I would be curious to hear from you is now that you have this perspective, looking back over your lifetime and looking back over the many lives you've touched through your teaching, do you see yourself turning to a next chapter in your life? Do you have unfinished work that you want to now focus on?
Oh, don't remind me. I started these memoirs, which were, I recorded them, started recording them actually before the pandemic. And now I had time to actually, because I did them, recorded them and to start editing and so on. And I, 2/3 of the way through, and, I sort of almost gave up. They haven't quite given up because there've been so many questions and so many people who've been wanting to talk. And there is this invention called Zoom, which has been, I suppose, a lifeline in many cases, because my teaching has continued. I mean, I'm retired as a professor emeritus, but I've been mentoring students sort of long. Somebody is doing a thesis, somebody has questions, somebody has a presentation in Finland, and they want me to be present at their MPhil presentation. So actually, life has been crowded, and yet I know I have to get back to doing an assessment, which possibly will come about once the memoirs are out of the way. No, there's always something else. And I don't plan it that way. I don't set it up that way. But I think it's very difficult to wrap up in a satisfactory manner. You always find that there is something that possibilities seem to occur constantly. I was a great traveler before COVID-19 hit, so that has been put paid to. But one has found other ways out of one's four walls, and one of them is thanks to Art Forum, being able to talk to friends across the seas, and having Mira not very far away to prod me, one has been able to manage this. So there's no answer to the question actually that you put to me.
But I'm confident there will be much more to come. We had one interesting little question that popped up in a comment from somebody out on Facebook. Mira, would you give us a couple of minutes of thoughts about your work? You've wonderfully unfolded your mother's career and experiences and influence. What's up in your world? What's your next project?
What's my next project? Well, teaching has been a huge part of my life for over 20 years now, so that goes on. But I do want to take time out for myself. So I've been writing. So other than the book that has been published, I'm now working on actually a work of fiction. I don't know where it came from or why it came into my head, but it's there. So I have to try and extract it. So that's what I'm working on right now. And I did actually do art for a year. I was in the foundation year at the National College before I went off to film school. So I'm trying to, find out if I still have some skill in my hand. So I've been drawing lately. So let's see where that goes. But mainly, I think over the summer it's going to be writing.
Wonderful. You know, I have this feeling. You know, we heard the quote from Fez writing so long ago, and we've heard many words from you, Salima, and now we hear words from you. I look forward to reading your novel. It's such an opportunity to hear this family's voice, generation after generation. Do you see in your children the next generation of writers, artists, and thinkers coming up?
I think artists. My son is plays music, so he plays the bass. He's playing guitar. He used to play drums, but he also is very good at drawing, and so is my daughter. So I definitely. I mean, they're not. I don't think they're going to be any doctors or lawyers coming out of this household anytime soon.
They're terribly overrated, doctors and lawyers. So we need artists and we need writers.
You need the healers. You need the healers.
That's absolutely right.
Of the other kind.
Yes, both the spiritual healers and the physical healers occasionally. So let me make sure there are no other questions coming from our community out here. More and more people who are just so enamored with what you have brought us this evening. It really was eye-opening and incredibly exciting. I did have a question about, you know, when we started all of this, I mentioned that we have this new this new holiday here in the United States that's all about the end of the period of enslavement of the Black community. And you mentioned the student of yours who created this piece focused on the tragedy that happened when Black Wall Street was destroyed. And you know, this has all become such a focal point of the last year. The year of the pandemic also has been the year of reconciling and addressing some of our long simmering challenges in American society. And I guess in global society, really, the issues of equality and fairness. The artist who created that work, do you know what she's gone on to do? Because
it's still ongoing. The installation is going to be there for a while. And of course, you know, because it's all out in the open, so the marigolds, which are, you know, getting infested with bugs and so on. And in the beginning, what she did was to try and salvage some of them, take them home, wash them, clean them, iron them, and put them back. And then eventually she decided that no, you know, part of this is the slow sort of integration, because it's cotton, they're made out of cotton. They're going to integrate with the earth and they're going to become part of it. The project is still ongoing. She was selected to be a part of a residency. So that is why she has been resident there for a while. I think it continues for the next, and she already has the next project in mind, which is to do with the earth and looking at the earth, the components of the earth, and you know what. So Sarah is very much, she's an American now in terms of the years that she has spent in the US. And yet she continues to have this wonderful relationship, which is, you know, with her origins. And I think she brings a richness back to her community in the US, because that is, after all, what, you know, what the US is about, is these people who came from other places. And so I have no doubt that she's going to do extremely significant, sensitive work, which speaks, it is out of, I mean, she does work, of course, which is in her practice, which is also can be part of the White Cube. I mean, she's been in a couple of interesting exhibitions there too. But it is very much to do with something which, and she constantly says, I am not an activist artist. You know, she has this sort of thing that, and yet her work is very much to do with people and with how it speaks. And I think that was recognized in this project that she has done, because they have picked her up and are looking at it. It's so genuinely moving. I have great hopes of her contribution, not just to the art world too, but to the community.
Yeah, we'll all keep our eyes open. Can you remind me where that piece is located right now?
It's in a green. The park is Greenwood. It's in Tulsa. It's actually
in Greenwood. Okay, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at Greenwood Park.
Yeah.
That's the place to look. Well, with that, we have reached the end of our allotted time period for the evening. I don't know that I can express for all of our viewers how much we appreciate the time that you have spent this evening, Mira, and you have spent, Salima, taking us on this little tour of your experiences, your thoughts, and your art. It really has been wonderful. And I hope as the pandemic eases and as we see the world coming back out of its shell, that we have an opportunity to meet each other in person, either in Lahore or here in San Francisco. So please try to make it here.
Looking forward to it. Thank you again. Thank you, Art Forum. Thank you, Asian Art Museum. And yes, we will meet.
Yes. Thank you once again from Art Forum. Thank you, Robert, for being here. It is truly an honor to have all of you. And this talk really has touched us all. You have really taken us through the whole life cycle, which we are very, very honored to be able to present to the Bay Area audience here today. So thank you ever so much. And I'd also like to take this time to thank our board members, our volunteers, and our executive team who've helped us put this event together. And once again, please do like, subscribe, and donate to artforumsf.org/donate. And take care, everybody. Be kind to one another. Bye-bye.
All right. Good night, Ambika. Good night, Salima. Good night, Buddha.
Bye-bye. Bye.